The elevator doors whispered open on the 38th floor, revealing what should have been an empty steel chamber. Instead, Marcus Wellington found himself staring at a tableau that would unravel everything he believed about loss, about grief, about the careful architecture of survival he had built around his wounded heart. There, on her knees with a threadbare cloth clutched in small hands, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her dark hair fell like a curtain across her face, as she worked with the methodical precision of someone far beyond her years, carefully wiping away scuff marks from the polished steel walls. Behind her stood a woman in the navy uniform of the building's cleaning crew, watching with the quiet alertness of a mother who had learned that the world was not always kind to small girls, who worked in places where they might not belong. The woman's auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered hands suggested stories of hard work and harder choices. There was something achingly familiar about the way she tilted her head, about the protective stance she maintained near the child, about the gentle authority in her voice as she murmured soft encouragements. Marcus stepped into the elevator, his Italian leather briefcase suddenly feeling absurdly heavy in his hand. The little girl looked up briefly, and for just a moment, he caught a glimpse of eyes that were bright and intelligent, and startlingly, impossibly familiar. Something deep in his chest began to stir a recognition he couldn't yet name, a stirring of instincts he had thought were buried forever with his daughter 4 years ago. The woman pressed herself against the elevator wall, clearly hoping to become invisible, to disappear into the background noise of a building where she was paid to work unnoticed. But the child seemed unaware of any social boundaries, any reason why a 6-year-old shouldn't speak directly to a man whose name appeared on the building directory, whose decisions affected hundreds of employees, whose grief had become the kind of legend that people whispered about in boardrooms and break rooms alike. Marcus Wellington had spent the better part of 4 decades learning how to read rooms, how to assess situations, how to maintain control even when the world seemed determined to slip from his grasp. But standing in that elevator, watching a little girl clean floors with the serious concentration of a master craftsman, he felt something shift in the carefully ordered universe he had constructed around his pain. At 42, Marcus commanded respect in boardrooms from Chicago to Los Angeles, his reputation built on an almost supernatural ability to see through deception, to find profit in places others saw only risk, to transform failing companies into industry leaders through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. His corner office overlooked the city like a throne room. His schedule was managed to the minute by an assistant who treated his time like a precious commodity, and his tailored suits were cut to perfection by a tailor whose other clients included senators and movie stars. But beneath the polished exterior of success lived a man who had been carved hollow by a loss so profound that it had redefined the very concept of surviving. 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days had passed since the phone call that shattered his world, since a nervous police officer had used words like accident and instantaneous, and so very sorry for your loss, while Marcus stood in his kitchen, still wearing the business suit he had planned to change out of before dinner with his family. Emma had been 7 years old, with laughing eyes that saw magic in ordinary moments, and paint-stained fingers that created worlds no adult could imagine. She had been riding her bicycle near their suburban home, practicing the route to her best friend's house that she had traveled dozens of times before, when a distracted driver ran a red light and transformed a perfect Tuesday afternoon into the kind of tragedy that splits families apart like driftwood in a storm. The funeral had been a blur of flowers and condolences, a parade of well-meaning faces offering comfort that felt as substantial as smoke. The legal proceedings that followed were a necessary torture, depositions and settlements that reduced his daughter's infinite potential to a dollar amount that felt both obscene and inadequate. The grief counseling sessions became an exercise in futility, hours spent with well-trained professionals who spoke about stages and healing as if loss was a problem that could be solved through proper technique and sufficient time. His wife Sarah couldn't bear the silence that filled their house after Emma's death, couldn't stand the sight of her daughter's bedroom preserved exactly as she had left it, couldn't forgive Marcus for working late that evening instead of being home to prevent something that couldn't have been prevented. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 months after the accident, as clinical and final as the death certificate, signed by a woman who had loved him for 15 years, but could no longer stand to share space with his grief. Now Marcus lived alone in a downtown penthouse, that felt more like an expensive hotel than a home, surrounded by the trappings of success that had once seemed meaningful, but now served mainly as insulation against the kind of memories that could destroy a man if he let them. His housekeeper maintained rooms he barely used, his personal chef prepared meals he often forgot to eat, and his therapist received regular cancellations accompanied by polite apologies and increasingly creative excuses. Work had become both salvation and prison, 14-hour days that left him too exhausted for the kind of reflection that led to dangerous places. His company had grown by 30% in the 4 years since Emma's death, fueled by the manic energy of a man who had learned that standing still meant drowning in thoughts too painful to bear. His employees respected him, his competitors feared him, and his board of directors had long since stopped questioning the wisdom of a CEO who seemed incapable of making a wrong business decision. The little girl in the elevator represented everything that Marcus had trained himself to avoid: innocence, vulnerability, the kind of uncomplicated joy that Emma had brought to every room she entered. Her clothes were clean but clearly second-hand, a pink sweater with tiny pulls in the fabric, jeans that were slightly too long and cuffed at the ankles, sneakers that had seen countless playgrounds and puddle-jumping adventures. Her movements were careful and deliberate as she worked, each motion guided by a seriousness that seemed both heartbreaking and strangely admirable. The woman who supervised her efforts radiated the kind of quiet dignity that Marcus had learned to recognize in people who had been shaped by circumstance into something stronger than they had ever planned to become. Her face suggested stories untold, experiences that had taught her when to speak and when to remain silent, when to trust and when to protect. There was something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, the protective alertness in her eyes, that spoke of a life lived on the margins, of choices made not from abundance but from necessity. As the elevator climbed toward Marcus's floor, he found himself studying the pair with an intensity that surprised him. The building employed dozens of maintenance workers, most of whom he passed without acknowledgement in his daily routine through corridors designed to keep executives like him insulated from the mechanics of daily operation. But something about this scene felt different, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle with recognition he couldn't quite place. The child worked with a focus that seemed almost meditative, her small hands moving in practiced circles as she addressed each imperfection in the elevator's surface. There was something achingly familiar about her concentration, about the way she approached each task as if it were a small work of art, about the quiet satisfaction she seemed to take in work well done. Marcus found himself remembering Saturday mornings in his old house, watching Emma arrange her crayons by color, watching her approach each drawing with the same methodical care he now observed in this strange little girl. When she looked up again, just before the elevator reached his floor, Marcus caught another glimpse of those startlingly intelligent eyes. For a moment that stretched longer than physics should have allowed, he felt as if he were looking into a mirror that reflected not his own face but something deeper, something that belonged to a life he had lost and mourned, and tried desperately to forget. The sensation was so strong, so immediate, that he had to grip the elevator's handrail to keep his balance. The doors opened with their customary whisper, revealing the familiar marble-floored corridor that led to his office suite. But as Marcus stepped into the hallway, briefcase in hand and thoughts churning with questions he couldn't yet formulate, he found himself turning back for one final look at the little girl, who had somehow managed to crack the carefully maintained facade of his professional composure. She was back to her work, small hands moving in steady circles, completely absorbed in the simple task of making something clean and bright and perfect. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched Marcus's perpetual internal climate and made the city look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. He entered the Sterling Towers lobby at precisely 7:30, as he had every workday for the past 3 years, nodding curtly to the security guard who had long since learned that Mr. Wellington preferred silence to small talk, especially in the early hours when his defenses were lowest, and his thoughts most likely to drift toward dangerous territory. The elevator doors opened to reveal yesterday's puzzle waiting for him once again, as if the universe had decided that some encounters were too important to be left to chance. The little girl was there, this time polishing the brass handrail with careful circular motions that reminded Marcus of the way Emma used to clean her bicycle before their weekend rides together. Her companion stood nearby, holding a spray bottle, and watching with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that the world could be unkind to people who worked with their hands in places designed for people who worked with their minds. Marcus stepped inside and pressed the button for his floor, watching in the polished steel reflection as the child continued her work with the same methodical precision he had observed the day before. The elevator began its smooth ascent, carrying them upward through a building where their paths should never have crossed, where the distance between corner offices and service corridors was measured not just in floors, but in entire worlds of experience and expectation. "Excuse me," the child said suddenly, her voice clear and surprisingly confident, cutting through the elevator's mechanical hum with the directness that only children seemed capable of achieving. "Are you Mr. Wellington?" Marcus turned, startled not just by being addressed but by the formal politeness in her tone, by the way she pronounced his name with the careful precision of someone who had practiced saying it correctly. In his world, children were generally kept at a comfortable distance, seen occasionally at company picnics or charity events, but rarely heard, certainly never engaged in direct conversation in professional settings. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice carrying the automatic courtesy that 4 decades of business interactions had made second nature, even as his mind raced to understand how this child knew his name, why she had chosen to use it. What possible connection could exist between her small world and his carefully insulated one? The girl smiled, and the expression was so sudden, so luminous, that it seemed to transform not just her face, but the entire enclosed space of the elevator. It was the kind of smile that belonged in children's books, the kind that suggested sunshine breaking through storm clouds, the kind that Emma used to wear when she was particularly pleased with something she had accomplished or discovered or understood. "Emma used to talk about you all the time," the child said, her words falling into the quiet space between them with the weight of stones dropped into still water. "She said you made the best pancakes in the whole world, especially the ones with blueberries arranged in smiley faces." The impact of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending his carefully maintained equilibrium spinning into chaos. His knees nearly buckled, and he gripped the elevator's handrail with white knuckles, his Italian leather briefcase forgotten, as it slipped from nerveless fingers and hit the floor with a sound that seemed to echo from very far away. Emma's Saturday morning pancakes had been their special tradition, a ritual so private and sacred that he had never mentioned it to anyone after her death. Not to Sarah during their painful final conversations, when they had tried and failed to find comfort in shared memories. Not to his therapist during sessions where he had carefully parceled out acceptable portions of his grief, while keeping the most precious memories locked away where professional sympathy couldn't diminish their power. Not even to his own mother when she had tried to coax stories from him during those early, impossible months, when everyone seemed to believe that talking about Emma would somehow make her absence easier to bear. The pancakes had been more than breakfast. They had been art projects and science experiments and excuses to spend unhurried time together before the demands of the day pulled them toward separate worlds. Emma had insisted on helping with every step, from measuring ingredients to flipping the finished products, her small hands guided by his larger ones, as they created edible masterpieces that existed nowhere except in their kitchen, in their memories, in the private mythology of a father and daughter who had found magic in something as simple as breakfast on Saturday mornings. "How do you?" Marcus began, then stopped, his voice failing completely, as the implications of what he had just heard began to penetrate the shock that had temporarily frozen his ability to think clearly. This child, this stranger, this little girl who cleaned elevators and should have had no connection to his life whatsoever, had just referenced something that belonged exclusively to his most guarded memories. The woman stepped forward quickly, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder with a movement that spoke of practiced caution, of experience dealing with situations that could turn unpredictable without warning. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice carrying a nervous tremor that suggested she understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. The way her daughter's innocent words had somehow breached defenses that Marcus had spent 4 years constructing. "She sometimes says things. Children have such active imaginations. You know how it is." Her explanation felt hollow, even as she offered it, the kind of excuse that adults gave when children said things that were inconvenient or impossible, or too true for comfort. She pressed the button for the next floor with obvious urgency, her body language broadcasting a desperate need to extract herself and her daughter from a situation that had suddenly become far more complicated than a simple encounter between a building owner and his maintenance staff. But the little girl looked up at Marcus with eyes that held no confusion, no childish fantasy, no sign that she was repeating something she had overheard or imagined or constructed from fragments of adult conversation. Instead, there was a knowing sadness in her gaze that seemed far too mature for her small face. A depth of understanding that suggested she was not guessing but remembering, not imagining but recounting something she had experienced firsthand. She also said you used to sing that song about the Sunshine Girl when she was scared during thunderstorms, the child continued, seemingly oblivious to the way her mother's grip on her shoulder had tightened, to the way Marcus had gone completely still, to the way the elevator's ordinary mechanical sounds suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in the silence that followed her words. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 23rd floor, a sound that Marcus had heard thousands of times without thinking but which now seemed to mark a moment of profound transition. A before and after that would define how he understood the world and his place in it. The doors opened with their familiar whisper, revealing a corridor lined with office doors and fluorescent lighting, and all the mundane details of a building where people came to work and conduct business and live lives that made sense according to predictable rules. The woman hurried her daughter out of the elevator, casting one anxious glance back at Marcus before they disappeared down the hallway, leaving him alone with questions that felt too large for the confined space he occupied. The elevator continued its journey upward, carrying him toward his office, and the familiar routines that had sustained him through 4 years of carefully managed grief. But Marcus remained frozen in place, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what he had just experienced. Nobody knew about the Sunshine Song. Nobody except Emma. And Emma was gone, buried in Graceland Cemetery, under a headstone that bore her name, and dates that marked the brief span of her time on Earth, and words that had felt inadequate, even as they were being carved into granite. The song had been something he had made up during a particularly fierce thunderstorm when Emma was 4 years old. A silly little tune about brave girls who carried sunshine in their pockets and could make rain clouds disappear just by believing in tomorrow. She had requested it dozens of times over the years, during storms both literal and metaphorical, during moments when the world felt too big or too scary or too uncertain for a little girl to navigate alone. It had become their secret weapon against fear, their private mythology of resilience and hope, something that belonged exclusively to the sacred space between a father and daughter who trusted each other with the deepest truths of their hearts. Marcus spent the rest of that day in a fog of confusion and impossible hope, mechanically attending meetings and signing documents and making decisions, while his thoughts circled obsessively around the little girl's impossible knowledge. He found himself staring out his office window at the city below, watching traffic move through streets that suddenly seemed foreign and unfamiliar, as if he were seeing them for the first time, or perhaps seeing them clearly for the first time in years. Every detail of the encounter played and replayed in his mind with the clarity of high-definition film, each word and gesture and expression magnified until it felt more real than the mahogany desk where he sat, more substantial than the quarterly report spread before him, more important than any business decision he had ever made. The specificity of the child's knowledge haunted him, not generic observations about fatherhood or parenting, but precise, intimate details that belonged to his most cherished and carefully guarded memories. That evening, instead of taking his usual route home to the penthouse that had become both sanctuary and prison, Marcus found himself descending to the building's lower levels, following maintenance corridors he had never explored in 3 years of daily occupancy. The Sterling Tower employed a small army of cleaning staff who worked largely invisible shifts, maintaining the gleaming facade that corporate tenants expected while remaining as unobtrusive as possible, moving through the building like ghosts who left behind only the evidence of their care and attention. The corridors below ground level were a different world from the marble and mahogany splendor of the executive floors, painted in practical colors and lit by fluorescent fixtures that cast everything in harsh, honest light. Marcus passed supply closets filled with industrial cleaning equipment, break rooms where workers gathered during brief respites from their shifts, offices where supervisors managed schedules and supplies, and the complex logistics of keeping a 40-story building spotless and functional. In a small office near the loading dock, he found what he was looking for: employee records, shift schedules, and the administrative details of the building's daily operations. A sympathetic security supervisor, curious about the CEO's unusual interest in staffing matters, but trained to accommodate the requests of people who signed his paychecks, provided the information Marcus had requested, without asking questions that might have been difficult to answer. The woman's name was Catherine Miller, a single mother who had been employed by the contracted cleaning company for 8 months. The little girl was her daughter, Lily Miller, who occasionally accompanied her mother to work during school breaks and sick days when other childcare arrangements couldn't be made. The records were sparse but official, containing the basic information required for employment and nothing that hinted at any connection to Marcus's previous life, to the daughter he had lost, to the memories that had been disturbed by a child's innocent observations. Armed with this information, Marcus began his own investigation, though he would not have called it that at the time. He found himself taking different routes through the building, timing his movements to coincide with the cleaning crew's schedule, positioning himself where he could observe Catherine and Lily without appearing to do so. It was the behavior of a man who had spent his career learning to gather information carefully and thoroughly, but applied now to a mystery that felt far more important than any business deal he had ever negotiated. Over the following days, he watched them work together with a tenderness that reminded him of his own relationship with Emma, noting the way Catherine supervised her daughter with gentle authority, the quiet conversations they shared while moving through their assigned tasks, the obvious love and protection that defined their interaction. Lily approached each responsibility with unusual seriousness for a child her age, as if she understood that her mother's job was important, that their presence in the building was a privilege that could be revoked if they drew unwanted attention or caused problems for the adults who made decisions about such things. But it was the small details that truly unnerved Marcus, the accumulating evidence that this child possessed knowledge that should have been impossible for her to have acquired through any normal means. On Wednesday, he watched through a conference room window as Lily carefully arranged cleaning supplies in a specific pattern, bottles grouped by size, cloths folded into precise squares, everything aligned with the same meticulous attention to order that Emma had shown when organizing her art supplies before beginning a new project. On Thursday, he noticed Lily humming a melody he recognized but hadn't heard in 4 years. The Sunshine Song, note, perfect, and in the same key Emma had always requested, sung with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had learned it not from sheet music or recordings, but from repetition, from love, from the kind of intimate transmission that occurred between people who trusted each other with their most private selves. Friday brought the most disturbing revelation yet. Marcus had stayed late, working through dinner as was his habit, pushing himself toward the kind of exhaustion that made sleep possible without dreams, when he heard the soft sound of someone crying in the hallway outside his office. The building was nearly empty at that hour, most of the daytime staff long gone, and the evening cleaning crew still hours away from reaching the executive floors. He opened his office door to find Lily sitting cross-legged on the carpet, her back against the wall and tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. The toy was worn and faded, clearly well-loved, with one ear that had been sewn back on and eyes that had been replaced with mismatched buttons. Catherine was nowhere to be seen, perhaps around the corner in another office, perhaps gathering supplies from a storage closet, perhaps simply trusting that her daughter would remain safe in a building where she had learned to feel comfortable. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, kneeling down to the child's level, despite every instinct, telling him to maintain professional distance, to call security, to handle this situation through proper channels, rather than engaging directly with a 6-year-old whose presence in his workplace was already raising questions he couldn't answer. Lily looked up with eyes red from crying, and for a moment Marcus felt as if he were looking into a mirror that reflected not his own grief but something equally profound, equally desperate. "I miss her so much," she whispered, her voice broken by the kind of sobs that seemed too large for such a small body. "Emma was my best friend, and now she's gone, and nobody talks about her anymore. Mommy says I shouldn't mention her name, but I don't want to forget." The revelation hit Marcus like ice water, shocking him into a clarity that was both wonderful and terrible. This child knew Emma had known her, had been her friend somehow, had loved her enough to mourn her absence 4 years after her death. But that was impossible. Emma's world had been carefully circumscribed by the boundaries that defined most children's lives. School, home, family activities, a few neighborhood playmates, whose parents Marcus and Sarah had known and trusted. Emma's social circle had been small and manageable, documented in birthday party photos and school directories, and the casual conversations that parents had about playdates and sleepovers, and the carefully orchestrated interactions that defined childhood in their suburban neighborhood. Marcus would have remembered another little girl in Emma's life, especially one whose presence was significant enough to warrant the kind of grief he now witnessed in Lily's tears. As Catherine appeared around the corner, her face pale with anxiety upon seeing her daughter talking to the building's owner, Marcus realized that the mystery was deeper and more complex than he had initially imagined. Someone was keeping secrets, and those secrets somehow connected his dead daughter to this living child in ways that defied rational explanation. The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating a tangle of possibilities that felt both promising and threatening, like a door that might open onto paradise or perdition depending on what lay hidden behind it. The weekend passed in restless contemplation, with Marcus poring over memories he had tried to bury, searching for any connection he might have overlooked, any detail that could explain how Lily Miller had come to possess knowledge that should have died with Emma. He found himself going through boxes he hadn't opened in years, looking at photographs he had been unable to bear, reading through Emma's school papers and art projects, and the accumulated ephemera of a childhood cut short. Sunday evening brought clarity in the form of a photograph he had almost thrown away during the painful process of packing Emma's belongings, a decision that had felt necessary at the time, but which he now recognized as an attempt to control grief by controlling the physical reminders that made it manifest. The photo showed Emma's 7th birthday party, a backyard celebration filled with balloons and laughter and all the manufactured joy that parents orchestrated for their children's special days. In the background of the image, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a young woman helping to serve cake to the assembled children, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, kind eyes that watched the children with gentle attention, the same protective posture Marcus had observed in the elevator. The recognition came flooding back like water breaking through a dam. Catherine Miller had been in his employ before, though not as a member of the cleaning staff. She had worked as a part-time housekeeper and occasional babysitter during Emma's final year, hired by Sarah to help manage the household while Marcus traveled frequently for business, and Sarah struggled to balance her own career with the demands of motherhood. The memory returned in fragments at first, then in a rush of details he had somehow managed to suppress. Catherine's gentle manner with Emma, her reliability, the way she had seemed to understand his daughter's moods and needs, without requiring extensive instruction or supervision. She had been there for approximately 6 months, a quiet presence who had made their lives easier without making herself indispensable, who had cared for Emma with the kind of attention that went beyond mere professional obligation. She had left abruptly after Emma's accident, with only a brief note expressing condolences and citing personal circumstances that had required her to relocate immediately. At the time, Marcus had been too deep in his own grief to question her departure, or to wonder what personal circumstances could have been urgent enough to require immediate action in the wake of such a tragedy. Monday morning found Marcus waiting in the building's lobby at 6 o'clock, intercepting Catherine as she arrived for her shift with Lily in tow, both of them bundled against the early spring cold, and carrying the quiet dignity of people who had learned to navigate the world with careful attention to boundaries and expectations. Catherine's face went white when she saw him, and she instinctively moved to shield Lily, who was carrying a small backpack and looking sleepy from the early hour. "We need to talk," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard but tempered with something gentler, perhaps desperation, perhaps hope, perhaps simply the recognition that some conversations required a different kind of power than what he wielded in boardrooms and business negotiations. Catherine's response was barely audible, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from understanding that some situations could not be controlled or managed or negotiated away. "Mr. Wellington, we should go. Lily shouldn't be late for school." But Marcus had seen the recognition in her eyes, the flash of memory and guilt and something that might have been relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment while simultaneously dreading it. The careful distance she had maintained, the way she had tried to become invisible in his building, the obvious anxiety she displayed whenever their paths crossed, it all made sense now as the behavior of someone who had been hiding in plain sight, someone who carried secrets that connected her to the most painful chapter of his life. "You worked for us," Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle that had been consuming him for days. You knew Emma. You left right after. He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't speak aloud the words that marked the boundary between his life, before and after. But he didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a bridge that had finally been completed, connecting two shores that had seemed impossibly distant just moments before. "Please," Catherine whispered, glancing around the busy lobby where early commuters were beginning to arrive, where security guards and maintenance workers and all the machinery of daily business were starting their routines, where a conversation like this could draw attention that might complicate everything. Not here. Not in front of her. They arranged to meet that evening in a small coffee shop several blocks away from the Sterling Tower, neutral territory where Catherine might feel safer sharing whatever truth she had been carrying for 4 years. The day dragged endlessly for Marcus. Each meeting and phone call an exercise in going through the motions while his mind raced with possibilities. Each more unlikely and more hopeful than the last. He found himself staring at his phone, checking the time obsessively, as if he could somehow accelerate the passage of hours through sheer force of will. That evening, seated across from Catherine in a dimly lit corner booth that offered privacy and shadows in equal measure, Marcus finally heard the story that had been hidden from him for 4 long years. Catherine's voice was steady but strained, as she explained how close she and Emma had become during those months of employment, how the little girl had confided dreams and fears that she sometimes couldn't share even with her parents, how their relationship had grown beyond professional boundaries into something that resembled family. Emma had drawn pictures of Catherine, had made her friendship bracelets with the patient dedication that children brought to crafts that adults considered trivial, had begged Sarah to let Catherine stay for dinner on numerous occasions. The relationship had been innocent and natural, the kind of bond that sometimes formed between children and the adults who cared for them with genuine affection rather than mere duty. The accident had devastated Catherine almost as much as it had destroyed Marcus and Sarah. She had attended the funeral from a distance, standing at the back of the church, where she wouldn't intrude on family grief, had written condolence letters she had never sent, because the words felt inadequate to express the magnitude of her loss. She had loved Emma not as a parent, but as someone who had been granted the privilege of witnessing a young life unfold in all its wonder and possibility. Her departure from their employ hadn't been voluntary. Sarah, drowning in her own sorrow and unable to bear reminders of their former life, had let all the household staff go in the weeks following Emma's death. The decision had been practical and understandable, but it had severed Catherine's connection to the only family she had known since moving to the city, leaving her to grieve alone while struggling to build a new life from the fragments of what remained. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached into her purse, withdrawing a worn manila envelope that looked as though it had been handled countless times, opened and closed, and carefully preserved through years of uncertainty about whether its contents would ever see daylight. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, each word requiring visible effort to speak aloud. "Something I should have told you years ago, but I was scared, and then time passed, and it seemed too late." She placed the envelope on the table between them but didn't immediately open it, as if the gesture alone required more courage than she could easily summon. Instead, she looked directly at Marcus, with eyes that held years of hidden anguish, years of carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. Emma wasn't alone the day of the accident. She was with Lily. The words landed like a physical blow, driving the air from Marcus's lungs and sending his carefully constructed understanding of that terrible day spinning into chaos. He felt the world tilt around him, felt the foundations of his grief shift and crack as new information forced him to rebuild everything he thought he knew about his daughter's final moments. "That's impossible," he said, his voice hoarse with shock. "The police report, the witnesses, they all said Emma was alone on her bicycle. The police never knew about Lily because I took her away before they arrived." Catherine's voice gained strength as she continued, as if finally sharing this burden was providing relief, even as it opened new wounds. "I had brought Lily to your house that afternoon. Sarah had called me she needed someone to watch Emma while she ran errands, and you were traveling for business. The girls were playing in the backyard, and then Emma wanted to ride her bike to the park. I should have said no, should have insisted they stay in the yard. But they begged so sweetly, and it seemed like such a harmless request." Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process this revelation. to understand how his daughter's death could have been witnessed by another child. How that witness could have remained hidden for 4 years. How the official version of events could have been so incomplete. All these years, he had imagined Emma's final moments as solitary, had tortured himself with images of his daughter alone, and frightened as a stranger's car bore down on her. The thought that she had been with a friend, that her last minutes might have been filled with laughter and companionship instead of loneliness, was both a gift and a fresh source of pain. Catherine opened the envelope with shaking fingers, revealing a collection of items that made Marcus's heart stop with their impossible familiarity. Emma's friendship bracelet, the pink one with rainbow beads that had gone missing from her room after the accident, the one he had searched for frantically because it had been her favorite piece of jewelry. A small drawing in Emma's distinctive style, showing 2 little girls holding hands under a smiling sun, their stick-figure faces beaming with the kind of joy that children could capture in ways that eluded trained artists. And most devastating of all, a Polaroid photograph of Emma and Lily together, their arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles that spoke of secrets shared and adventures planned, and the kind of friendship that existed only in childhood, when love was simple and trust was automatic, and the future seemed infinite with possibility. They were inseparable whenever I brought Lily with me to work, Catherine continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks as she spoke words she had kept locked inside for years. Emma called Lily her secret sister. They made up games and shared secrets and planned adventures they would take when they were older. Lily adored Emma, worshipped her. Really, Emma was everything Lily wanted to be. Confident, artistic, loved unconditionally by parents who could give her everything she needed. The coffee shop seemed to fade around them as Marcus stared at the photograph, seeing his daughter's face animated with joy he had almost forgotten existed, seeing her surrounded by the kind of happiness that had defined her short life. But confusion still clouded his understanding, questions multiplying faster than answers, as he tried to make sense of what he was learning. If Lily was there during the accident, he said slowly, how is she? How is she here now? How did she survive when Emma didn't? Catherine's sob was audible, a sound of grief so profound that it seemed to carry the weight of years of hidden sorrow. Because it wasn't Emma who died that day, Marcus. It was Lily. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible and undeniable at the same time. Marcus felt his world reorganize itself around this new reality, felt the careful architecture of his grief collapse and rebuild itself according to laws he didn't understand, possibilities he had never imagined. The coffee shop continued its evening business around them, other customers coming and going and living lives that made sense according to predictable rules, but Marcus felt as if he had stepped through a doorway into a different universe entirely. The girls had switched clothes that morning. They did that sometimes, playing dress-up with each other's things, trading jackets and hair ribbons, and the small accessories that seemed so important to 6- and 7-year-olds. Lily was wearing Emma's jacket, Emma's helmet, riding Emma's bicycle when the car ran the red light. When the accident happened, when I got to the scene, I saw my daughter's body on the asphalt, but she was wearing Emma's identification bracelet, the one with her name, and your phone number that Sarah insisted she wear whenever she left the house. Catherine's voice broke as she continued, each word seeming to cost her something essential. The paramedics, the police, everyone assumed they were looking at Emma Wellington, and Emma was standing there in shock, wearing Lily's clothes, not speaking, not responding to her own name, completely traumatized by what she had witnessed. In all the chaos and confusion, with sirens and emergency vehicles and people trying to save a child who was already gone, nobody questioned the identification. Nobody looked closely enough to realize that the girl who had survived wasn't the same girl whose name was on the bracelet. Marcus felt the room spinning around him, felt his grip on reality loosening as the implications of what he was hearing began to penetrate his consciousness. 4 years of grief, 4 years of mourning a child who was alive, 4 years of building his life around a loss that had never actually occurred. The magnitude of the deception, however unintentional, felt almost too large to comprehend. Where? He began, then stopped, his voice failing, as the question formed in his mind. Where is Emma now? Catherine reached across the table and grasped his hand, her fingers cold and trembling but steady in their grip. She's been with me all along. The trauma of witnessing Lily's death, of losing her best friend so violently, caused her to retreat so deeply into herself that she began to believe she was Lily. The doctors said it was a form of dissociative identity disorder brought on by survivor's guilt, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to cope with something too terrible for a 7-year-old mind to process. The words washed over Marcus like waves, each revelation reshaping his understanding of everything he thought he knew about loss, about identity, about the ways that human beings survived unbearable circumstances. "She genuinely believes she's my daughter?" he asked, though even as he spoke the words he knew they weren't quite right, weren't capturing the complexity of what Catherine was trying to explain. "She genuinely believes she's Lily Miller," Catherine corrected gently. "She remembers Emma Wellington as her beloved friend, someone who died in a tragic accident 4 years ago. She doesn't remember being Emma herself. That identity is completely buried, protected by psychological walls that her mind built to keep her functioning." The therapist said that forcing her to remember might cause a complete psychological break, that she might never recover if we pushed too hard, too fast. Marcus stared at the photograph again, seeing his daughter's face but trying to reconcile it with the little girl who had cleaned his elevator, who had spoken of Emma in the past tense, who had mourned her as a lost friend, rather than recognizing herself in a mirror. The complexity of the situation felt overwhelming, a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together according to any logic he understood. "So the child I've been seeing in the building," he said slowly, working through the implications step by step. "The little girl who knows things about Emma that she shouldn't know that's Emma herself, but she doesn't know she's Emma. She knows those things because they're her own memories," Catherine confirmed, "but she's recontextualized them as memories of her friend. When she talks about Emma's favorite foods or Emma's bedtime songs or Emma's relationship with her father, she's remembering her own experiences but attributing them to someone else. It's her mind's way of keeping those memories alive while protecting her from the identity that's associated with such profound trauma." The revelation sent Marcus into a spiral of emotions so complex and overwhelming that he couldn't separate them into individual components: rage at being deceived, joy at discovering his daughter was alive, anguish over the years of unnecessary grief, and a desperate, clawing need to somehow reach through the psychological barriers that separated him from the child who was his, but didn't know it. He pushed back from the table so violently that his chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh and discordant in the quiet coffee shop. Other patrons turned to look, their conversations momentarily interrupted by the obvious distress of a man who appeared to be coming apart at the seams. "You let me believe my daughter was dead for 4 years, he said, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating with an anger that felt both righteous and helpless. "You let me bury an empty coffin, let my marriage fall apart. Let me destroy my entire life grieving for a child who was alive and living 20 minutes away from me." Catherine flinched, but didn't retreat from his fury. Didn't try to minimize or deflect the accusation that hung between them like a blade. "I tried to tell you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks. "I called the hospital that first night, but you were sedated, and the staff wouldn't let me speak to family members. I came to the funeral home during visiting hours, but Sarah was surrounded by relatives, and I couldn't find the right moment, the right words to explain something so impossible. So you decided to play God with my family?" Marcus demanded, his hands shaking with rage and grief, and 4 years of accumulated pain that suddenly had a target, a focus, someone to blame for the suffering that had defined his existence since that terrible Tuesday afternoon. "You decided to steal my daughter and let me suffer while you played house with a child who belonged to me. I was 19 years old and terrified." Catherine shot back, her own emotions finally breaking through the careful control she had maintained throughout their conversation. "My daughter was dead, and I was trying to care for a traumatized child who didn't remember her own identity, who would only respond to me because I was the only familiar person in her world. The doctors said she needed stability, familiar surroundings, people she trusted. What was I supposed to do, abandon her to the foster system while you and Sarah fell apart?" The coffee shop around them had grown quiet, other customers sensing the intensity of their conversation and instinctively giving them space. But Marcus was barely aware of their surroundings. The weight of 4 years of buried grief and fury threatened to consume him entirely, to reduce him to something primitive and destructive that would tear apart everything in reach. including the woman who had somehow become both the architect and the victim of an impossible situation. "She's been living as Lily Miller," Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength as she fought to make him understand the complexity of what they faced, the lack of simple solutions to a problem that had no precedent in either of their experiences. "I legally adopted her after the accident, changed her records, enrolled her in school under her new identity. She's happy, Marcus. She has friends, she does well in her classes, she doesn't have nightmares anymore. The therapy helped her create a stable sense of self, even if it's not the identity she was born with." Marcus sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. This wasn't simply a matter of reclaiming stolen property or correcting a bureaucratic error. This was a child whose psychological survival had depended on forgetting who she really was, whose mental health was built on foundations that might crumble if the truth was revealed too suddenly or carelessly. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion and confusion. "How do I get my daughter back without destroying the person she's become? How do we help her remember who she really is without breaking her mind in the process?" Catherine wiped her eyes with a napkin, leaving tracks in her makeup that made her look younger and more vulnerable, more like the 19-year-old girl who had found herself responsible for a traumatized child and impossible choices. "The doctors always said that someday, when she was stronger, when the trauma had healed more completely, we might be able to help her remember gradually. I always planned to tell you eventually, to bring you back into her life somehow. I didn't know how. And each year that passed made it harder to imagine how to begin." They sat in silence for several minutes. Two people who had loved the same child, grappling with the magnitude of the deception that had shaped both their lives, the way that good intentions and impossible circumstances had created a situation that seemed to have no clean resolution. The coffee shop continued its evening business around them, the ordinary world proceeding according to predictable rhythms, while they tried to navigate territory that had no maps, no guidelines, no precedent for how to proceed. Finally, Marcus spoke the words that terrified him more than any business decision he had ever made, more than any risk he had ever taken in 4 decades of calculated gambles and strategic maneuvers. "I want to see her. I want to try to help her remember who she really is. But I want to do it right, safely, in whatever way is best for her, rather than what's easiest for me." The journey back to that moment had been neither quick nor simple, requiring months of consultation with specialists who dealt in the rare intersection of trauma psychology and identity disorders, legal experts who could navigate the complex bureaucracy of changed names and forged documents and adoption papers that told only part of the truth. It had involved family therapists and child psychologists who approached Emma's case with the careful precision of surgeons, understanding that the wrong move at the wrong time could destroy everything they were trying to preserve. Most importantly, it had required Marcus to set aside his desperate desire for immediate reconciliation in favor of what was best for the child who had once been Emma and was now, in all the ways that mattered to her daily existence, Lily Miller. The process had been excruciating in its gradual pace, each session and breakthrough and setback measured against the possibility that moving too fast might cost him his daughter all over again, this time permanently. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning that dawned clear and bright, with the kind of spring sunshine that made everything seem possible, Marcus found himself standing outside a modest apartment building in a neighborhood he had never had reason to visit before. In his hands was a grocery bag containing blueberries and flour and eggs and all the other ingredients for pancakes. A recipe he had committed to memory 7 years ago, when Emma was small enough to stand on a kitchen chair beside him, her face dusted with flour as she helped measure and mix and create something magical out of ordinary ingredients. The building was older but well-maintained, the kind of place where working families lived with dignity despite limited resources, where children played in courtyard gardens and neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for each other's welfare. It was a different world from the penthouse where Marcus had spent 4 years learning to live with loss, but it felt more alive, more connected to the rhythms of actual life than the isolated luxury he had surrounded himself with. Catherine opened the door with a nervous smile, stepping aside to let him enter the small but warm apartment that had been his daughter's home for 4 years. The walls were decorated with children's artwork, including several pieces he recognized as bearing the distinctive style Emma had developed in her original life, bold colors and imaginative creatures that existed nowhere but in her mind, the same creative vision expressed through hands that remembered how to create, even when the mind that guided them had forgotten who they belonged to. "Lily," Catherine called softly, "Mr. Marcus is here." The little girl appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron that was far too large for her small frame, and carrying a wooden spoon with the serious concentration of someone who took cooking very seriously. Over the past months of carefully supervised visits, she had begun to warm to Marcus, to look forward to his presence without the anxiety that had marked their first encounters in the elevator. She still remembered Emma as her beloved friend, still spoke of her in the past tense, with the kind of grief that seemed too mature for someone so young. But there were moments fleeting and precious when something deeper seemed to stir in her eyes. When she would pause in the middle of a sentence, as if listening to a voice only she could hear, when her face would take on an expression of confusion and longing that suggested some part of her mind was trying to break through the walls that protected her from remembering. "Are you ready to make pancakes?" Marcus asked, kneeling down to her level, with the same careful attention to her comfort and autonomy that the therapists had taught him was essential to building trust with a traumatized child. Lily nodded enthusiastically, then surprised him by reaching out to take his hand, her small fingers warm and trusting in a way that made his heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. "Emma used to tell me about the smiley-face pancakes," she said, her voice carrying the wistful tone she always used when speaking of her lost friend. "She said they were magic because they made everyone happy, even on sad days." Marcus's throat tightened with emotion, but he managed to smile, understanding that this was how they would proceed through Emma's memories attributed to Emma as a separate person, through the gradual building of trust and familiarity that might eventually allow the walls to come down naturally. "She was right about that," he said, his voice steady, despite the tears he held back. "Should we make some magic together?" They worked side by side in Catherine's tiny kitchen, Marcus guiding Lily's small hands as she stirred the batter, watching her face light up with delight. When the first pancake emerged from the pan, in a perfect golden circle, when he added the blueberry smile, arranging the fruit with the same care he had shown years ago in a different kitchen with the same child, she clapped her hands in delight, and for just a moment, Marcus saw something flicker across her features, a ghost of recognition, a stirring of memory that belonged not to Lily remembering Emma's stories, but to Emma remembering her own experiences. As they sat down to eat their creation, Lily positioned between Marcus and Catherine at the small kitchen table, something profound settled into place that had nothing to do with the official resolution of their complicated situation, and everything to do with the simple act of sharing a meal with people who cared about each other. Despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together, this wasn't the family Marcus had lost, and it wasn't the life he had planned or imagined or dreamed about during 4 years of carefully managed grief. But it was real and precious and worth fighting for. A constellation of love and loss and hope that existed outside the boundaries of conventional definitions. Emma might be gone in one sense, buried beneath psychological defenses that might never fully dissolve, but she lived on in Lily's laughter, in her artistic spirit, in the love that connected all three of them across the chasm of tragedy and time, and the mysterious workings of a child's mind, under impossible stress. Outside the kitchen window, morning sunlight streamed through glass that had been cleaned to spotless clarity by hands that had learned to find dignity in work, illuminating their small feast. And the new beginning it represented. Marcus took a bite of pancake, tasting blueberries and hope, and the possibility that some losses were not final, that some endings were actually transformations, that love could survive even the death of identity, if it was patient enough and strong enough, and willing to accept forms it had never expected to take. The little girl who had been Emma, and was now Lily, reached across the table to pat his hand with syrup-sticky fingers, smiling with the uncomplicated joy that belonged to children who felt safe and loved and seen for who they were in the present moment, rather than who they had been or might become. And in that gesture, Marcus found something he had thought was lost forever. The possibility of building a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it, the chance to love his daughter not as the ghost of who she had been, but as the person she was becoming, one pancake breakfast at a time.